So let me tell you about the moment I opened my GPS tracker app on a Tuesday morning in February, saw a little blinking dot sitting right inside Debra Ledbetter's garage, and nearly choked on my coffee. That blinking dot was my snowblower. And that is where this whole ridiculous story really begins. But to fully appreciate how satisfying the ending was, you need to understand what led up to it. You need to understand the neighborhood, the HOA, and most importantly, you need to understand Debra Ledbetter herself. Because Debra was not just some mild-mannered woman who made an honest mistake. Debra was the kind of person who had been building towards something like this for years, and the snowblower was simply the moment she finally crossed a line she could not come back from. I moved into Maplecrest Village about 4 years ago. It is one of those planned communities in the upper Midwest where the houses are nice, the streets are clean, and the HOA dues are enough to make you wince every time the bill shows up. When I first toured the neighborhood, I thought the HOA was going to be one of those calm, professional operations that just handled common area maintenance and the occasional fence dispute. I was naive. I was very, very naive. Within about 6 months of moving in, I started noticing things. Notices on doors, letters in mailboxes, little yellow warning tags zip-tied to anything the HOA deemed out of compliance. A neighbor 3 houses down got a letter because his holiday lights were still up on January 7th. Another neighbor got cited because her welcome mat was, quote, not of an approved earth tone palette. I am not making that up. Earth tones only, people. The HOA rulebook was apparently written by someone with a very strong opinion about terracotta. And right at the center of all of it, like the sun around which all HOA drama orbited, was Debra Ledbetter. Debra was the HOA compliance chair, which is the kind of title that sounds impressive until you realize it essentially means she was the neighborhood's self-appointed hall monitor. She was maybe 52, 53 years old, with perfectly blow-dried hair that somehow stayed immaculate even in a blizzard, and she drove a white SUV with a little Maplecrest Village HOA parking pass hanging from the rearview mirror like a badge of honor. She had lived in the neighborhood for 11 years, which she reminded everyone of frequently, as if tenure alone gave her some kind of moral authority over the rest of us. She walked the streets of Maplecrest like she owned them. Literally walked them with a clipboard in certain weather, measuring snow depth on driveways to see if residents had shoveled within the required 2-hour window after a snowfall. Yes, she had a ruler. She had measured my driveway twice in the first winter I lived here, and both times she knocked on my door to inform me that my snow removal had been, and I quote, insufficient in thoroughness. My driveway was fine. I had shoveled it. I just had not shoveled every single granule of packed snow from the edges, and apparently that was a violation of Section 14, Paragraph 3 of the Maplecrest Village Community Standards Manual, which prohibited residents from allowing accumulation of frozen precipitation to remain along the driveway perimeter for longer than 2 hours following the cessation of snowfall. I started reading that manual cover to cover after the second visit. Because if Debra Ledbetter was going to quote it at me, I was going to know it better than she did. That turned out to be one of the smartest decisions I ever made. Now let me tell you about the shed situation, because that is critical backstory. My property has a detached garage and a separate storage shed in the backyard. The shed is maybe 12 by 16 feet, built on a concrete pad, and I keep it locked with a heavy-duty padlock. Inside that shed, I keep my lawn equipment, my outdoor tools, and during winter I keep my snowblower and my generator. When I say I keep them locked up, I mean I take that seriously. I installed a motion-activated security camera on the shed eave about 2 years ago after a neighbor on the next block had a lawnmower stolen. And about a year after that, I started putting GPS trackers on my expensive equipment. AirTag-style trackers, tucked into little pockets sewn into the equipment bags or mounted discreetly on the machine frames. The snowblower had one mounted inside the housing near the auger assembly, tucked behind a side panel. You would never find it unless you knew to look. I told my buddy Marcus about the trackers one night over drinks and he called me paranoid. I called it prepared. We were both right, honestly, but I was the one who ended up being glad about it. The winter that year had been relentless. By the time February rolled around, we had already gotten 4 significant snowfalls and the whole neighborhood was buried. Maplecrest Village sits in a band of the upper Midwest that gets hammered by lake-effect snow pretty regularly, and that year was no exception. The roads were a mess, the plows were struggling to keep up with the main streets, and the residential streets inside our community were basically packed snow on top of ice with a thin veneer of fresh powder on top. Every single morning was a negotiation between you and your driveway about who was going to win that day. I had a system. I kept my snowblower fueled and ready in the shed, and every time we got more than 2 inches, I would roll it out and clear my driveway and walkways before work. My next-door neighbor, an older gentleman named Ray Kowalski, had a bad back and could not operate heavy equipment anymore, so I always cleared his driveway too. Ray was 71 years old, retired, and about the most decent person on the block. He always had a cup of coffee waiting for me on the porch railing after I finished his driveway. Thermos already poured, steam rising in the cold air. That was our arrangement and we both liked it. The snowblower I had was a serious machine. Not a little residential unit. I had a 2-stage, 11-horsepower unit with heated hand grips, power steering, and a 12-inch clearing depth. It cost me around $2,000 and it was worth every penny. Heavy, powerful, and built for exactly the kind of deep, wet Midwestern snow we were dealing with. It weighed close to 300 pounds, so it was not something you picked up and walked away with easily. But it had wheels and it could be moved with some effort. The week before the incident, Debra had been on a tear. We had gotten a major storm, about 14 inches over 2 days, and the neighborhood was still digging out. Debra had been walking the block with her clipboard, noting which driveways were still not cleared to her satisfaction. She left yellow warning slips on 3 doors, including mine, even though I had cleared my driveway down to the concrete. Her complaint on my slip was that the snow I had blown had created a pile at the end of my driveway that extended approximately 4 inches past my property line onto the sidewalk edge, which she claimed was a violation of Section 22 regarding snow placement. 4 inches. She cited me for 4 inches of displaced snow pile. I filed the citation in a folder I keep specifically for HOA nonsense, which at this point was pretty thick. I had been documenting everything for almost 2 years. Every notice, every letter, every yellow slip, every encounter. I had dates, times, photographs, the works. I had started doing this because something told me that one day it was going to matter. And I want to be very clear that I am not naturally a suspicious or litigious person. I am a software engineer who likes his house, likes his neighbor Ray, and likes clearing snow in peace. But Debra had pushed enough buttons that I had gone into documentation mode pretty much full time. On the Monday before everything went sideways, I came home from work and noticed something immediately off. The padlock on my shed was hanging open. I always lock that padlock with a very specific feel, a practiced click and tug, and I had locked it that morning. Now it was just hanging there, the shackle not fully seated. I pulled out my phone and checked my shed camera feed right there in the driveway. The camera stores footage on a local card and also backs up to cloud storage. I scrubbed through the afternoon footage and there she was, Debra Ledbetter, walking into my backyard through the side gate, bold as you please, at 2:47 in the afternoon. Now here is what gets me. The side gate to my backyard is not locked. It is just a wooden gate with a latch. There is no fence around the whole property, just that section along the side that defines the yard. So she had just walked in, like she had every right to. She was wearing her big puffy coat, her HOA lanyard hanging around her neck, and she was carrying a bolt cutter. A bolt cutter. She had brought a bolt cutter to cut my padlock. I watched on the footage as she walked up to the shed, inspected the padlock for about 10 seconds, then used the bolt cutters on it, clean through the shackle in one squeeze. She opened the shed, went inside, and about 4 minutes later she backed my snowblower out of the shed on its wheels, maneuvered it around to the front of the house, and then the footage cut off as she took it around the corner. She had replaced the padlock hasp so it looked closed from a distance but had put a different smaller lock on it, one she presumably had the key to secure it back up. She had thought of that detail, which actually made it worse because that meant this was premeditated. I just stood in my driveway in 12-degree weather holding my phone and feeling my blood pressure tick up one notch at a time. I went inside, opened my GPS tracking app, and searched for the snowblower's tracker. It pinged immediately. It was 0.3 miles away from my house, sitting still, at an address I did not need to look up because I already knew whose house it was. Debra Ledbetter's garage. She had taken my snowblower to her own garage. I sat down at my kitchen table, poured myself a glass of water, and spent about 5 minutes just thinking through what I knew versus what I needed to find out. Here is what I knew for certain at that moment. Debra Ledbetter had entered my property without permission. She had cut my padlock with bolt cutters, which she had clearly brought with her on purpose. She had taken my snowblower, which was my personal property. She had taken it to her own home. And my GPS tracker was currently showing me exactly where it sat. That was a lot of very clean, very documented facts. What I did not know yet was what justification, if any, she intended to use. I suspected there was some HOA angle here because there always was with Debra, but cutting someone's lock and taking their personal property out of their shed was not an HOA fine. That was not a yellow warning slip. That was theft. Plain and simple. I called my neighbor Marcus, who is actually an attorney, though not a criminal attorney. He practices real estate and contract law, but he is sharp and he knows how to think through legal problems quickly. I laid out the situation in about 90 seconds and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Alex, that is criminal theft and possibly burglary. You need to call the police tonight. Not tomorrow, tonight." He also said to not confront her directly before talking to the police, because I needed the official report to precede any confrontation so everything stayed clean and documented. I agreed. I opened a fresh note on my laptop and typed out a full timeline of events with timestamps from the camera footage. I exported the footage from the cloud backup to a folder on my desktop. I screenshotted the GPS tracker app showing the snowblower's location at Debra's address. I photographed the cut padlock on my shed. I photographed the interior of the shed showing the empty space where the snowblower normally sat. I did all of this before calling the police because I wanted to have everything organized before I started talking to anyone official. Then I called the non-emergency police line. The dispatcher was professional and a little surprised when I described the situation. She said she would send an officer out and that it might be about 45 minutes given road conditions. Which was fair, honestly, because the roads in the neighborhood were still pretty bad from the most recent storm, and the main roads were not much better. I said that was fine and I would be here. While I waited for the officer, I did one more thing. I went through my thick folder of HOA documentation and pulled every single interaction involving Debra Ledbetter going back 2 years. I sorted them by date, made a neat stack, and put them in a fresh manila envelope. I also pulled up the Maplecrest Village HOA governing documents on my laptop, specifically the sections about HOA authority, enforcement procedures, and what the HOA was and was not permitted to do on resident property. I had read these before, but I reread the relevant sections now with fresh eyes. There was nothing in those documents, nothing at all, that gave the HOA the authority to enter a resident's property, cut their lock, and remove personal property. The enforcement procedures were strictly limited to written notices, fines, and if necessary, formal hearings before the HOA board. That was it. Physical removal of personal property from inside a resident storage structure was so far outside the scope of HOA authority that it was almost laughable that she had tried it. The officer who arrived was a younger guy, mid-30s, stocky, with ice crystals on his jacket from the walk up my driveway, because the temperature had dropped to about 7 degrees by then. Officer Dale Prout, according to his nameplate. He stamped his feet on my porch and I let him in and offered him coffee, which he declined, and I walked him through everything I had. He watched the shed camera footage on my laptop. He watched it twice. He looked at the GPS tracker screenshot showing the equipment at Debra's address. He looked at the cut padlock. He looked at my documentation folder and raised his eyebrows when he saw how thick it was. "So this woman is on your HOA," he said. "She is the compliance chair," I said. He nodded slowly like someone connecting dots. "And she came onto your property with bolt cutters and took your snowblower to her own house." "That is correct," I said. "Does she have any documentation that the HOA authorized the seizure of your equipment?" "No, and I have read every inch of the HOA governing documents, and there is no provision that would allow this under any circumstances. The HOA's enforcement tools are limited to written notices, fines, and formal hearings." He wrote several things down. He said he was going to contact the HOA management company to confirm whether any formal proceeding or authorization existed for this action, and he was also going to go speak with Debra Ledbetter. He said that depending on what she said, this could be processed as theft given the dollar value of the snowblower, which at $2,000 well exceeded the misdemeanor threshold. He said not to contact her myself and to let him handle the initial contact. I said I would be patient. I meant it. Officer Prout was at my door again about 2 hours later. His expression was a specific kind of tired that I recognized as the look of someone who had just spent time dealing with a person who was simultaneously very difficult and very wrong. He told me Debra had refused to return the snowblower initially, and that she had claimed the HOA had authorized her to impound it because I had, according to her, been storing it improperly in a structure that was not compliant with HOA shed regulations. She had produced a printed sheet of paper that she claimed was an official HOA equipment impound notice. But when he called the HOA management company, the woman who answered said she had never heard of such a document, and that the HOA had absolutely no impound authority over resident property. He told me that Debra had eventually returned the snowblower to him after he explained that the alternative was being arrested at her front door that night, and that the snowblower was currently in the back of his patrol vehicle, and he would bring it to my garage right now. He said the case was going to be referred for a formal charge review, and that Debra would likely receive a summons, not an arrest that evening, but that the case was being treated seriously because of the premeditated nature of the bolt cutters, the amount of the equipment, and the fact that she had lied to him about having HOA authorization. I walked out into the frozen night and helped him roll my snowblower off his patrol vehicle's cargo ramp and back into my shed. I put a new padlock on it, a heavy-duty one I had in my garage. Then I shook his hand, thanked him, and went back inside. I sent a text to Marcus telling him what happened. He texted back, "Do not say a single word to her. Let it go through the system." I was planning on it. Here is where the story gets even more interesting, though. Because Debra, being Debra, did not go quiet. She did not sit at home and reflect on her choices and realize she had made a catastrophic error. No. Debra went on the HOA community forum, which was a neighborhood Facebook group type of platform that about 80% of residents used regularly, and she posted a lengthy, florid message about how she had been conducting routine compliance enforcement when she had been harassed and threatened by a resident and victimized by law enforcement. She did not name me directly, but she used enough detail that anyone in the neighborhood who knew me would figure it out immediately. I read that post and felt something click into place. I had been keeping my head down for 2 years while this woman harassed half the neighborhood. I had been quietly documenting and not engaging. I had watched her bully Ray about the height of his hedges. I had watched her send formal letters to a young couple down the block about the color of their front door mat. I had watched her reduce a woman named Cheryl Oates to tears at an HOA meeting over a garden ornament. And now, she was on the community forum trying to spin herself as the victim of the situation she had created by committing a crime. I decided it was time to be less quiet. Within the scope of what was true and documented, of course, I posted a response on the forum. I kept it factual, calm, and very thorough. I explained that the HOA compliance chair had entered my private property without my permission, cut my padlock with bolt cutters she had brought specifically for that purpose, and removed my personal property valued at approximately $2,000. I stated that I had full camera footage of the entire event. I stated that I had GPS tracking data confirming where my property had been taken. I stated that the police had been involved and confirmed that the action was not authorized by the HOA's governing documents or by the HOA management company. I stated that the matter had been referred for criminal charge review. I attached the screenshot of the GPS tracker showing the equipment at her address. I did not post the camera footage itself yet, because Officer Pruitt had suggested I hold that in reserve in case it was needed for the formal charge process. Then I closed my laptop and went to bed, because it was almost midnight and I had work in the morning. I woke up to my phone absolutely exploding. The post had over 40 comments by 7 in the morning. People were flooding in with their own stories about Debra. Turns out, I was not the only person she had been pushing around, and not the only person who had been quietly documenting things. A woman named Patricia Huang 2 streets over said Debra had entered her backyard without permission twice to photograph alleged violations. A man named Tom Bertrand said Debra had threatened him with HOA legal action for having a portable basketball hoop in his driveway, which was allowed under the current rules, and that she had told him verbally the rules were being changed, which they had not been. Cheryl Oates, the woman I mentioned earlier, posted a long comment describing years of targeted harassment, including letters sent to her home employer at one point. Ray Kowalski, my neighbor who I do not think had ever posted on the forum in his life, wrote a single comment that said, "She measured my hedge with a ruler 3 times in 1 month while I was in physical therapy. I am 71 years old. Enough is enough." That comment got more responses than anything else. By the end of that day, there was an organized petition being circulated to hold a special HOA meeting and vote on removing Debra from the compliance chair position. The petition hit the required signature threshold, which I had helpfully looked up in the HOA bylaws and included in a follow-up post within about 4 hours. The HOA president, a relatively sensible man named Gerald Acaffer, who I think had privately wanted Debra reined in for some time, confirmed via the forum that a special meeting would be scheduled within the 2-week window required by the bylaws. Meanwhile, the weather kept coming. February had absolutely no sympathy for anyone's drama. We got another 7 inches over a Wednesday and Thursday, and I was out at 6 in the morning both days clearing my driveway and Ray's. The cold was genuinely brutal, the kind that makes your nose hairs freeze on the first breath and makes every metal surface feel like it will stick to your fingers. My snowblower ran perfectly. I kept looking at it rolling through the snow and feeling this low, warm satisfaction that it was back where it belonged, and that the woman who had tried to take it was in significantly more legal trouble than she had anticipated. Debra had gone conspicuously quiet on the forum after my post. She had deleted her original message at some point, probably after seeing the response it generated, but several neighbors had screenshotted it. The internet is forever, as they say. Or at least community forums are. About a week after the incident, I heard from Officer Pruitt again. He called to let me know that the case had been reviewed and that a formal charge was being filed. The charge was theft in the second degree, which in our state covered property theft where the value of the stolen item exceeded $500. It is a felony charge. Now look, I want to be fair here. I did not know at the time of the incident whether a felony charge would result or whether it would get reduced through the process. But the initial filing was at the felony level given the value of the equipment and the premeditated use of the bolt cutters. Debra would be receiving a formal summons requiring her to appear in court. He also mentioned, almost as an aside, that when they had done a formal follow-up and checked what the official HOA equipment impound notice Debra had produced actually was, it turned out to be a document she had created herself in Microsoft Word. She had made a fake HOA form to try to cover herself. He said that document was being treated as potential evidence of attempting to obstruct the initial police inquiry, which added another wrinkle to her situation. I thanked him, hung up, and called Marcus. Marcus made a noise that was halfway between a laugh and a groan. She made a fake form, he said. She made a fake form, I confirmed. Alex, she is not going to enjoy the next several months of her life. He was right about that. The special HOA meeting was set for a Thursday evening about 10 days after the incident. They held it at the community center building near the main entrance to Maplecrest Village, a little brick building with a meeting room that could hold maybe 60 people if everyone sat close. On that Thursday night, every seat was full, and there were people standing along the walls. I had never seen that many people at an HOA meeting in 4 years of living here. I counted at least 70 residents, which out of around 140 homes in Maplecrest was a remarkable turnout. Gerald Acaffer, the HOA president, opened the meeting and looked genuinely somewhat overwhelmed by the crowd. He was a calm, businesslike guy in his late 50s, an accountant by profession, and I think he was genuinely uncomfortable with the drama that had accumulated around his tenure as president. He read a prepared statement acknowledging the incidents that had led to the meeting and confirming that the HOA board did not authorize, and would never authorize, any board member or officer to physically remove personal property from a resident's premises. Debra was not at the meeting. I had not expected her to be, honestly. She had gone basically dark in the community for the past week. People got up to speak, one after another. The stories came out, some of them funny in hindsight, some of them genuinely awful in the moment they had occurred. There was the woman whose children had been playing in the front yard with a plastic outdoor playhouse and received a certified letter threatening a $25 per day fine. There was the couple who had painted their shutters a shade of blue that Debra had decided was out of compliance. So Debra had taken it upon herself to bring over paint swatches from an approved palette and leave them on their porch without being asked, with a note attached that said, "For when you are ready to fix this." There was a man named Dave Colber who had gotten 5 separate written notices in 1 calendar year about the placement of his recycling bins, notices that he argued and won each time through the formal HOA appeals process, only to get another notice a few weeks later on a slightly different technicality. I spoke briefly. I kept it tight and factual. I described what had happened, confirmed I had full camera documentation, confirmed the police matter was ongoing, and said that my only goal at this meeting was to make sure the community had accurate information, and that the right procedural changes were made so nothing like this could happen to any resident again. There was a formal vote on the removal of Debra Ledbetter from the position of compliance chair. The vote was 58-3 in favor of removal. Whoever cast those 3 votes in her favor was a mystery to everyone present, though speculation afterward was entertaining. Gerald Acaffer announced that the compliance chair position would be restructured with clear, written guidelines defining the precise limits of HOA officer authority on resident property, a mandatory 2-person confirmation process before any enforcement action, and a resident appeals line to the management company that bypassed the compliance chair entirely. He said the HOA's legal counsel had already been contacted and would be reviewing all enforcement procedures within the next 30 days. People applauded. It was not a dramatic, movie-style standing ovation moment. It was more like the quiet, satisfied applause of a group of people who had been ground down by small frustrations for a long time and had finally gotten a clear, sensible resolution. It felt real. Ray Kowalski was sitting next to me at that meeting, and when the vote result was announced, he just nodded very slowly, the way old men do when something confirms what they already knew was right. Then he said, quietly, "Coffee's on me Thursday morning after the snow, Alex." And I said that worked for me. Now here is the part of the story that I want to make sure I give proper time to, because it is genuinely important and I do not want to just gloss over it in the name of wrapping things up fast. The legal process for Debra moved forward over the next few months. It was not quick and it was not simple, because the legal system is not a movie and things take time. But it moved. She hired a defense attorney fairly quickly, which was her right. Her attorney initially sent a letter to the HOA management company and to Gerald Acaffer claiming that Debra had been acting within the scope of her HOA authority and that the charge should therefore be dismissed. This argument went exactly nowhere because, as I had confirmed in my original research, and as the HOA management company had confirmed to Officer Prout the night of the incident, there was no such authority. The letter was ignored by the management company and forwarded to the prosecutor's office for context. Debra's attorney then apparently tried a different angle, arguing that the GPS tracking of her location constituted some kind of privacy violation on my part. This was also a non-starter because the GPS tracker was on my property and was tracking my property, not her. I had not tracked Debra. I had tracked my snowblower, which happened to be at her address because she had taken it there. Marcus had a field day with this argument when I told him about it. "She took your stuff and then argued about being tracked," he said. "The audacity is genuinely impressive." The fake HOA form she had produced turned out to be the detail that really complicated her defense because it demonstrated that she knew what she was doing was not actually authorized. If she had genuinely believed she was acting with HOA authority, she would not have needed to create a fake document to show the police. The existence of that document was essentially an admission that she had known she needed authorization she did not have and had tried to fabricate it. Her attorney tried to argue the form was just a rough draft of something she intended to propose to the board, but the prosecutor had the metadata from the file, which showed it had been created and modified multiple times in the 48 hours before she took the snowblower. That timing was not helpful for her defense. The case eventually resolved about 5 months after the incident. Debra accepted a plea arrangement that involved a guilty plea to a reduced charge of misdemeanor theft, a suspended sentence, 18 months of probation, a fine, and a formal civil settlement with me that included full replacement value for the destroyed padlock, and an additional payment that I will say was sufficient to make the whole situation feel appropriately resolved without me needing to litigate every detail in open court. I had honestly not gone into this wanting to destroy her financially. I had wanted her to face real accountability for something that was genuinely a crime, and the combination of the criminal record, the probation, and the civil settlement accomplished that. She also, per the terms of the civil settlement, agreed to a formal no-contact provision, meaning she could not approach my property or interact with me in any official capacity going forward. Given that she was no longer on the HOA by then, that was not a complicated requirement to meet. She did not move out of Maplecrest village. I half expected her to, honestly. But she stayed. She became considerably quieter. I would see her occasionally at the mailbox or driving past in her white SUV, and she would look the other way. I did not wave. I had no particular hostility toward her at that point, but I was not going to pretend things were fine either. Life in the neighborhood genuinely changed after all of this, and I want to talk about that because I think it is the part of the story that matters most in the long run. Not the legal outcome, not the dramatic meeting, but the actual day-to-day change in how people in Maplecrest lived. Gerald Ackafer followed through on everything he had promised at the special meeting. The HOA enforcement procedures were formally revised and published to all residents. The new procedures were clear, sensible, and actually consistent with what the governing documents had always said the HOA's authority was. No more random interpretations of vague clauses. No more single officer deciding what was or was not a violation and sending certified letters without board review. No more showing up in people's backyards with a ruler and a clipboard. A new compliance chair was elected, a soft-spoken retired teacher named Barbara Finch, who seemed to genuinely believe that the point of community standards was to maintain a pleasant neighborhood rather than to control people's front porches. Barbara's first action in the role was to send a friendly letter to all residents reminding them of the actual rules, noting which rules had been enforced inconsistently in the past and would no longer be priorities, and inviting anyone with questions to simply email her. Patricia Huang organized an unofficial winter block gathering at her house a few weeks after the HOA meeting, which about 30 neighbors attended. There was a bonfire in her backyard, and everyone brought food and hot drinks, and we stood in about 15-degree weather being unreasonably cheerful about it, because there is something about shared frustration and shared resolution that bonds people in a way that easy times never quite do. Ray came and brought his wife Margaret, who I had actually never met before, and she turned out to be wonderful. We talked for about an hour near the fire about absolutely nothing to do with HOAs or snowblowers. Tom Bertrand, the guy who had been harassed about his basketball hoop, got his driveway professionally repaved in spring and did not have to inform anyone about it because driveways were not subject to HOA review under the actual rules. He seemed to enjoy that fact quite a bit. Cheryl Oates, the woman who had been reduced to tears at that meeting years ago, became very active in the restructured HOA going forward and eventually ran for and won a board seat. She brought the same meticulous documentation energy to the board that she had previously applied to defending herself against Debra's complaints, but used it entirely differently, keeping records of everything the board promised and following up until it was done. I bought a new padlock for the shed. 2 of them, actually. Heavy duty, the kind with a boron steel shackle that, based on the product description, requires industrial-grade cutters to get through rather than standard bolt cutters. I also added a second camera angled differently to cover a blind spot the original one had, and I made sure all my GPS trackers had fresh batteries and current firmware. Because yes, I still do all that. I'm still a person who puts GPS trackers on his equipment. That part of me has not changed and probably will not. The thing about Debra, the part I found myself thinking about on long cold mornings while the snowblower was running and the snow was coming off the chute in a wide, clean arc, was that she had not actually set out to commit a crime, or at least I do not think she had. I think she had accumulated so much unchallenged authority over so many years, made so many decisions that nobody formally contested in time, that she had genuinely convinced herself she could do whatever she decided needed doing and call it HOA business. That is what happens when small power goes unchecked for long enough. It stops feeling like borrowed authority and starts feeling like natural right. And then one day you show up with bolt cutters and a fake form, and you step directly into a man's shed camera and GPS tracker, and reality reasserts itself pretty sharply. I do not say that as an excuse for what she did. She made choices, real choices, and she faced real consequences. But I think understanding why someone like Debra happens, why she is possible in the first place, is part of making sure she stays a cautionary tale rather than a recurring problem. She happened because people who had the information and the standing to push back on her just quietly absorbed the harassment rather than confronting it. Myself included, for the first couple of years. I had been building my documentation folder as a kind of passive defense rather than ever using it. It took her crossing a line so obviously and so completely that ignoring it was not possible for any of us to finally come together and say enough. That is the part I most wanted to change going forward. Not the locks on my shed, not the cameras, not the trackers, all of which I was keeping regardless, but the habit of absorbing small abuses of authority because confronting them feels like more trouble than they are worth, because the trouble of confrontation is finite. The trouble of unchallenged small abuses is cumulative, and it compounds over time until you are doing bolt cutters in February. On the Thursday after the HOA meeting, there was another snowfall. About 4 inches overnight, wet and heavy. I was up at 5:30, because that is just what you do when you live in the upper Midwest in February, and I had my driveway and Ray's driveway cleared by 6:45. Not because of any HOA rule, because Ray's back hurt and because I had a snowblower and he was my neighbor. I was putting the snowblower away in the shed when Ray's porch light came on. He came out in his coat and slippers, which I have told him 1,000 times is a recipe for an ice fall, and he set the thermos on the porch railing the way he always did, steam coming off the cap in the cold, dark air. "You see the news," he said. "Not yet," I said. "What's happening?" "Nothing," he said. "I just meant in general it is always something," I laughed. "Yeah," I said, "it always is." I took the coffee, stood at the railing looking out at the clean white driveways in the early morning dark, and thought about how good it was to have a neighbor worth getting up at 5:30 for, about how quiet the neighborhood felt in the snow, about how the GPS tracker app was right there in my pocket if I ever needed it. I did not open it that morning. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. The snowblower was in its shed. The new padlock was locked. The camera was recording its steady, uneventful footage of nothing happening, which is the best possible kind of footage for a shed camera to capture. The air was cold and clear and still. Maplecrest Village was having a normal winter morning, which after everything that had happened felt like something genuinely worth appreciating. Ray went inside after about 10 minutes because of the slippers and the cold. I finished the coffee, rinsed the cup with a handful of snow the way he had shown me was the neighborly thing to do when you returned a thermos cup in winter, and set it back on his railing. The sky was getting lighter by the time I walked back to my house. 7 degrees and clear, with that blue-gray winter light that comes just before the sun actually crests the horizon. I could see footprints in the fresh snow, mine and Ray's and no one else's. Everything was good. The HOA was finally what it was always supposed to be, a set of reasonable community standards managed by people who actually cared about the community rather than their own authority over it. The woman who had turned it into something else was facing consequences that were proportional to what she had actually done. The neighborhood had done the hard thing and come together when it mattered. And my snowblower was safe and accounted for, tracked, locked, and right where I had left it. That was enough. More than enough, honestly. I stepped inside, kicked the snow off my boots, and started a pot of coffee because it was going to be a long day and I had earned it. And somewhere in Maplecrest Village, I was confident that absolutely nobody was walking around with bolt cutters looking for a shed to open, because they knew better now. They all knew better, and if by some wild chance anyone ever forgot that lesson, well, I still had the tracker on.